Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Savitt. Welcome back to the Center for Security Policy for the continuation of our webinar series. We have 3 webinars already set for the fall. To see our schedule, go to securefreedom.org and check under the webinar tab. I'll also give you a preview of upcoming events at the end of today's broadcast. Today's program is a special commemoration on the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. We welcome 2 guests, Ambassador Pete Hoekstra and Deborah Burlingame, to help us reflect on the events of 9/11 and the path ahead. The Center's Fred Flights will moderate. Please note that you are in listen-only mode, but you could submit your text questions in the Q&A box in your GoToWebinar panel. I'll read as many questions as possible at the end of the program. This event is being simulcast on C-SPAN 1 and C-SPAN Radio, and will be recorded and made available on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/securefreedom, and via our website at securefreedom.org. With that, I'll hand it to the Center's President, Fred Flights.
Hey, Adam, thank you. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining this important webinar to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks against the United States. The theme of this panel is, it is our responsibility to educate future generations about what happened on September 11, 2001. On that day, 19 members of the radical Islamist group al-Qaeda hijacked 4 civilian airliners. They crashed 2 into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, 1 into the Pentagon. The 4th plane, United Airlines 93, crashed into the ground near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, after the passengers on the plane made a heroic effort to regain control of it. "Let's roll" was the rallying cry of the Flight 93 heroes that day. The terrorist attacks killed almost 3,000 people. Hundreds of heroic first responders were killed trying to rescue people from the World Trade Center. This included 343 members of the New York Fire Department. These attacks changed our nation, our security, and the way we viewed the world. It led to a 20-year war in Afghanistan, but they also showed the resilience of the American people and how we were able to come together as a nation after these horrific attacks. Although increased U.S. security stopped major terrorist attacks like 9/11 since 2001, the Heritage Foundation has documented over 80 attacks of terror against our nation since that year, many by radical Islamist groups. It's vital we talk about the 9/11 attacks, not just the loss of life and the way it changed our nation, but we have to speak plainly about who was responsible and their motivation. Because unfortunately, there is a growing trend in the mainstream media among educators. There is cancel culture to not talk about that these were terrorist attacks committed by a radical Islamist group known as al-Qaeda. The press and some educators don't want to admit the fact that this group was at war not just with the United States, but with modern society. They want to leave out how these attacks were just one of a string of radical Islamist attacks around the world. And with the disastrous U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, radical Islamists scored a huge win against our country. Afghanistan may become a safe haven for terrorism again. And we know that the Taliban acquired more than $85 billion in American weapons, some of which are likely to go to their allies, al-Qaeda, which has a presence in Afghanistan that's likely to grow. So we have a lot to talk about today. I'm going to quickly introduce our 2 distinguished panelists and then start our discussion. Deborah Burlingame is an attorney and an expert on terrorism. Her brother, Charles Chic Burlingame, was the pilot of American Airlines Flight 77 that al-Qaeda terrorists crashed into the Pentagon on 9/11. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra is chairman of the Center for Security Policy Advisory Board. He served as U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands during the Trump administration. Pete represented the 2nd District of Michigan in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1993 to 2011. During that time, he served as chairman and ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, and I'm honored to say I had the opportunity to work with him on the staff of that committee. Deborah and Pete, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So Deborah, I want to start by offering my condolences to you for your personal loss and recognize your brother for his service to our country in the Navy, and to thank you for your work, honor his legacy and that of families who lost loved ones. I also want to start by just ask you to offer your reflections on this terrible day after 20 years.
I will echo what you said. The fact that 20 years have passed you do get a different perspective about that day, the long view. But one of the things I worried about when we started building the 9/11 museum, shortly thereafter the planning began, and I was asked to be on the board. My worry was that it was too soon to build this museum because the history was still happening. We didn't know where this was going to go, and we couldn't distill in, put it in amber that day and set it aside as if this was a terrible thing we'd experienced. And I didn't think that would resonate. I worried about the generations, the kids who were too young to remember, and the adults who weren't yet born. And that's where we are today. So when I think about 9/11, I think about the incredible, the extreme nature of that attack, the unexpected and extreme nature, the confusion surrounding it. Our government was completely unprepared, and so were we. And I think it could have broken me, Fred, but the American people responded magnificently. They really, truly saved us, the families and those who experienced this in a deeply personal way. It was incredibly uplifting and reassuring. It really gave me hope. And I think of it now today as the day that human decency triumphed over human depravity.
Thank you. Ambassador Hoekstra, you were a member of Congress on September 11, 2001, and you were in the Capitol, a building that the 9/11 Commission thinks the 9/11 hijackers wanted to destroy, to kill you and other members of Congress and staff. What are your recollections on that day?
Well, before I get to the recollections, let me just say it's an honor to be on this panel with Deborah. Deborah and the other families that paid such a dear price on 9/11, they have been, just stalwarts in, 2001, 2002, 2003 to get Congress to do what it needed to do in terms of reforming how we would keep America safe. They were, just an inspiration to all of us. Every time we would see them, every time we would meet with them, and every time we would interact with them. They lost so much, but over the last 20 years, they've given so much back to this country to make sure that we did the right thing. On that day, it was Tuesday morning. I'm in my Capitol office, and it's another day at work. It's another day of doing the things that you do when you're in Congress, just like for 300 million Americans. It was a day at work going about their normal business. And, I'll never forget, I was talking about, I was meeting with some of my asparagus farmers about the threats to their business from imports from Chile and from Mexico. And, shortly thereafter, we're going through the meeting, and my office got a call from my district office, and they said, "Hey, you need to turn on TV. Tell Pete what's going on." And so we turn on the TV, and you see what's happening in New York City. You then hear about a crash at the Pentagon, and from my office, I could look out over some of the other office buildings on the Capitol Hill complex, and you could see the plume of smoke rising from the Pentagon. You would look down in the streets, and you would see the hundreds of thousands of people that are, flooding out of the buildings, flooding out of the Capitol, and being told to go home. Leave. There's still, I think, a plane in the air, and we're not sure where it's headed. So, get out of the buildings and go home. And the Capitol Hill police coming over, and we spent much of the rest of that day in kind of the fog of an attack, or what some might call the fog of war, really not understanding what had happened, who attacked us, why. We weren't expecting these kinds of events to take place, that a battlefield, because we'd been struck by al-Qaeda before, but that the battlefield would move to the homeland, that it would move to New York, that it would move to Washington, that it would move to Pennsylvania. So there was just a lot of confusion and trying to figure out what was happening. We received a briefing later on in the afternoon, late afternoon. And then I think something that politicians and the public can learn from that day is that evening we were on the steps of the Capitol. And we came together, not as Republicans, not as Democrats, but we came together as Americans, recognizing that all of us as members of Congress would have an awesome responsibility in front of us in terms of designing and responding to the events of that day. How would we hold those people accountable? How would we provide security and protection to America moving forward? And at the close of that session, 300 people on the stairs of the Capitol break out into song singing "God Bless America," and a sense of unity, of purpose, a conviction to move forward. And you start with great sadness in the morning because you recognize the suffering of what is happening to our country. And you recognize that evening that we're still America, we're still one country, and that we can get this job done. And that's what we've been trying, or what Washington and others have been trying to do for the last 20 years: keep America safe and move forward.
Deborah, what steps need to be taken to better educate Americans, especially America's youths, about 9/11, and what lessons are we at risk of losing as time passes?
Well, the museum itself has, the 9/11 Museum in New York has launched a webinar series that they do in the schools all across America on 9/11. It's increasing year by year. I think they're up to 350,000 students. But that's really not enough because it's on one day. And I think it's really important to really start teaching our kids the history, more history in the schools about this country, so that 9/11 is put in a context, sort of a current events kind of thing. And I think 9/11 can't really be understood without that context. But because you're right, our country was attacked before, but not on our own, not on the homeland. So we now have a Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security. Didn't exist before. The homeland became, we thought we were invincible, separated by two oceans and pretty darn safe. So I think I really like to see more of the history. So we learn about the previous attacks. The terrorism that existed in the 70s was very, very different in the way it was done. Lots of airline hijackings and disparate bombings from place to place. But we had warnings for this. I think the first mass casualty attack was Khobar Towers, and that was Hezbollah. But al-Qaeda said, "Hey, that was pretty interesting thing you did there. Show us how to do it." And now we know that they actually taught them how. We had Pete, you would know the other attacks. I remember going to Africa in 1998, right 2 weeks after the bombing there. That was an incredible attack on our embassies in Nairobi and Tanzania. It injured some 4,000 people. I believe 224 people were killed, and the injuries were horrific. People were maimed, parts of their bodies. I mean, this wasn't just a few scratches and getting out of the building. This was a horrific thing. That was our embassies, and most Americans probably don't know much about it. I remember going to a meeting in the White House and with families, and it was for all terrorism victims. And I sat next to a man whose wife was killed in that attack. We forget about those. So I'd like to see something done in the schools. You don't want to scare these kids. It has to be age appropriate, but you want to tell them that we live in a dangerous world, and we have to approach it in a way that is responsible. We have to work together with other members of the human community in other countries, as we have with NATO. And so that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see some effort, a national effort to get this programming done. But I'm not sure how to accomplish that, because education isn't I don't really know how that works. I know there's the federal system and the state schools have they have a big say, but I'd really like to see this done, because I think the education part is very, very important.
Hey, Pete, I want to turn to you. Do you think we're safer against radical Islamist terrorism than we were before 9/11? And what things were done after the attacks that maybe we could have done better, things that maybe you did or the federal government did to keep us safe?
Yeah, let me build off of Deborah's comments in terms of, we need to understand why we were attacked, and that is an education process. We were attacked because of what we stand for, the rights of women, democracy, freedom, and those types of things, freedom of religion. There are people who despise us for the freedoms and those types of things that we embrace because they threaten their way of life and their worldview. And that may, and the things that we do and what we stand for make us unique, and people need to understand that. It doesn't say that America's perfect, but it does say that what we stand for is threatening to other parts of the world, and it's because what we do is good. What have we done? I mean, you think back, we did the Patriot Act, we did the reform of the intelligence community, and those pieces of legislation are imperfect, and in some ways they're now providing government with a way to go after people, Americans, on their own soil. We should have put much more, tighter limits on the authorities, on the federal government, as to where they could use these authorities to keep us safe, and make it even more abundantly clear that these authorities could only be used against people who lived outside of the United States who were not American citizens, and made sure that we really limited the scope and the authorities of the federal government, because as many of us have seen, too often when you give the federal government too many authorities, it will use them in ways that some have never envisioned, but bureaucrats see them as an opportunity. I think you can't talk about 9/11 without talking about Afghanistan. What could we have done better? We could have made sure that on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, that it was not the Taliban that was in control of Afghanistan again. These are the people that provided a safe haven to al-Qaeda to plan and prepare to attack the United States of America. They are now back in authority of Afghanistan. That is a tragedy, that on the 20th anniversary, that is where we are at. That in some ways we moved away from, limiting the possibilities of an attack, because the war's not over. The threat is still there, and we've just maybe moved the battlefield a little bit closer back to the homeland. You also can't talk about the 20th anniversary and commemoration without recognizing some of the other actions that we took in terms of trying to topple regimes and to have nation building in Iraq, and in Libya, Syria, and the cost of human lives, American and others, that those events led to. And in hindsight, a number of those activities where we were a diversion from the real threat, radical Islam. And so we could have stayed much more focused, and we would have been in a much safer world today if we had not engaged in some of those activities. And it seems that too often we didn't learn from our mistakes. When you talk about military doctrine, so often you're talking about lessons learned. The military's talking about that, about the recent events in Afghanistan, but it doesn't seem to me that we've learned nearly enough over the last 20 years. We not only need a lessons learned of what recently happened in Afghanistan, we need a lessons learned exercise about what we should have learned over the last 20 years in this asymmetrical type of warfare and this type of unusual threat.
I want to get to Afghanistan in a moment, Deborah, but I just want to ask a similar question I asked to Pete. What do you think about what we did after 9/11? Did it make us safer, and should we have done some things differently?
I think because America is the melting pot, the pluralistic society. We have people come here, people who've been here before we were a country. They descended from some of the founders, or the earliest people who came. We have immigrants from all different nations. I think it was 190 countries were among the victims at the World Trade Center. And different religions. New York has always had, I lived in New York City for almost 30 years. I didn't realize there are 200 mosques in New York City because it's sort of a normal thing. It's very American. And I think one of the mistakes we made was to assume that Muslims in the Western world who live here with us as friends and neighbors and co-workers and even family members didn't experience the attacks the way we did, because we are not, someone like me or most people who were killed were not Muslim. And so we rushed to reassure them that Islam is a religion of peace. Well, Islam is a lot more complicated than a sentence like that. There are more Muslims killed who suffer the consequences of these extremist regimes like the Taliban, the extreme and harsh end of Sharia law. And I always hasten to say, when someone calls me an Islamophobe in the media, tell that to the dozens and dozens and thousands, really, of Muslim men, women, children who are brutalized by the extreme versions of this. So I think if I could go back and change something, I would have the messaging coming out of the White House to be a little more complicated than Islam is a religion of peace, because that was, I think, very difficult. At least it was for me. The mixed messages that these aren't really Muslims. Well, these are Muslims. It's just an extreme form of Muslims, and it's sort of a third rail you don't talk about, because in this country, there is freedom of religion, and I think that's a very difficult. That's a subject matter that's been discussed at the, by many experts, Center for Security Policy. I wish that could have been handled differently, and I think in some ways the reaching out to people to make this okay, because Muslims suffer too in this country. Americans. I saw a video of a 14-year-old boy on YouTube, Muslim kid, who was just bereft of these attacks and not wanting anyone to think he was like them. So I think that's important. I mean, to reassure a kid like that. But I think it's also important to distinguish, so that we know he's not like that. We know that these people are not like you and your family. I think that was a piece that we missed. And as a result of that, for many years, I remember when I was reading the Gore investigation after Pan Am 103, I looked at some of the people who were on these committees. Well, Nawaf Hazmi, who is the executive director of CARE, which is now on the FBI's material support for terrorist lists, he was on the committee for that report on the issue of privacy with respect to passenger screening. He was a guy who was standing next to President Bush on the Friday after the attacks to reassure people. This is a member of an organization that was found by a judge to be an organization that engages in material support for terrorism. So I think we have to be smarter and a little bit more discerning when we go about the very correct business of saying to our Muslim friends, neighbors, we welcome you, we want you here, we know you're good people, and we want you to enjoy your religion in peace and prosperity. But we need to go after the people that are the other end of this spectrum and read the Quran very differently. And that's my biggest criticism of what happened during the Bush administration.
Let me ask you a related question. The New York Times and the left think the 9/11 museum in New York is Islamophobic, and they want it transformed. Now, I know you were involved in this museum. What's your take on that?
Well, I'd like to know what the basis for that charge is, because in my view, there's almost nothing in it about Islam. And in fact, I remember, I mean, I will tell you, being on the board, I always felt, I was on the program committee actually. And some of the CARE actually want to be bounced off. They started a petition to get me off because I'm an Islamophobe. But I remember when I went through before the museums opened, it was all done, and the board members went through, and I remember at the section over there that had this what became a controversial film narrated by a prominent NBC news guy. Looking for the story of these hijackers and who they were and why they were. And of course, everyone associates al-Qaeda bad, right? But al-Qaeda is a terrorist group. What motivates al-Qaeda? Well, it's a religious point of view. I mean, I agree with Pete that they don't like our way of life, but why? It's not just that it's about freedom, because it's also that it's about we are the infidel. We are not observant members of the Ummah, and there's a in the philosophy that they read, the religious interpretation of the Quran that they read, it's their religious obligation to deal with us wherever we are, and that's why you have attacks all over the world, not just in America. You have them in, you had the London bombing in 2005, the Madrid bombing in 2003. You had Charlie Hebdo. You had indiscriminate lone wolf type attacks that weren't even in the United States. So I think the issue of grappling with this, and it's very uncomfortable as Americans, it's not the way we were raised up, but it has to be done. And I'm perfectly happy to be called an Islamophobe if the person calling me that is associated with a terrorist organization, because a phobia is an irrational fear, and it's not irrational to fear a terrorist organization. And that's the distinction I would make, that I wish is made more, because I think not talking about this gives them some purchase, some leverage to sort of shut people up and intimidate them into not talking about this.
Pete, I want to get your comments on that too, but I also want to raise with you the ongoing trial of KSM Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks. His trial is still underway 20 years later.
Right.
And I wonder, you've done a lot of work on Guantanamo. What are your concerns about that and Biden's apparent intention to free the Guantanamo prisoners?
Well, let me just, as we would say in Congress, let me associate my views with the woman from New York, Deborah. Well stated and bravely stated, and you'll get some flack for it, but thank you for speaking with that type of clarity and honesty. One of the things, Fred, that when you and I worked together on the Intelligence Committee, what we saw too frequently was we were at war, but we're trying to treat this like law enforcement. There would be an incident or there would be an attack in Afghanistan, and the one that always, the kind that always bothered me the most were when after an incident or whatever, there would be people considering that maybe American soldiers ought to be charged for doing this or that. And I know that, again, mistakes happen in the military, but it's like, whoa, wait a minute, these people, these soldiers, they're in war. They're, in some cases, it's killed or be killed. And I met with some of these guys and people in the intelligence community who had to do the difficult work of trying to get the information to keep America safe. And sometimes they just found themselves that at some point they were going to be the victims. With KSM and some of these other folks, it looks like, yeah, 20 years later, justice has not been served. Well, how do you hold them accountable and their colleagues accountable? It's not like a regular courtroom. I'm not an attorney, but if there's an event and we capture somebody on the battlefield, it seems like, well, we don't really know what happened. It's kind of like, of course not. You don't go to the battlefield, put up the yellow crime tape, and go out and collect evidence to prove exactly what happened and who these people are. All you know is that you picked them up on the battlefield and they probably had a gun and they were probably trying to kill you. This war is not over. We put them in Guantanamo. And as we saw with President Obama, when he released these 5 Taliban, or these 5 individuals from Gitmo, that 4 of them, in exchange for Bo Bergdahl, that 4 of these are now, in the last 24, 48 hours, they're a key part of the new Taliban government in Afghanistan, the government that will provide a safe haven to al-Qaeda, and in probably some ways, even though the reporting is, they are sworn enemies of ISIS-K, at the end of the day, they have more in common with those organizations than they will have with America. These people threatened America. They carried out attacks against America, the ones that are now going on, where the trial is resuming after 500 days. And, the bottom line is we're still at war. These people have indicated their desire to attack the United States. They executed attacks, and they ought to be held and detained for as long as this process goes on. It will be interesting to see how this goes on. But a trial that lasts for 20 years, I can pretty assuredly tell you that justice will not be served through this process. I have no idea even what rules of law they will apply after 20 years. These are just bad people, and we need to keep them out of the system. They can't be let free. They will attack us again.
I want to focus the rest of this discussion on Afghanistan and the disastrous withdrawal by President Biden. We partnered with the Taliban, a terrorist group. We know that the Taliban continues to be allied to al-Qaeda, that there's an al-Qaeda presence in Afghanistan. We know that al-Qaeda leaders who had taken refuge in Pakistan and Iran have returned to Afghanistan since we left. We know that there's $80 billion in weapons in Afghanistan that almost certainly will flow to al-Qaeda. And this argument that the Taliban and ISIS-K don't get along, I'm not sure that I buy that, because we know that the Taliban released thousands of ISIS-K prisoners from the Bagram Air Force Base prison. They let them go. And my guess is that whatever hostility there is between these groups, it won't last long. We know that these weapons, that some of them are being sent to Iran. There's photos of armored vehicles being shipped to Iran. Other weapons will be shipped and sold to China and Russia. These weapons will be used to stage future terrorist attacks. So, Deborah, I want to turn to you, and I hate to put it this way, but based on what happened in Afghanistan, is it September 10th again for America?
Absolutely. And I can't tell you how it grieves me to go to this memorial on Saturday observance, knowing that we are in, I believe, much more danger today than we were the night before September 11th happened. Absolutely. Because we've given up so much, including territory. We don't have any, we don't have an American presence on the ground. Afghanistan is a very, very big country. And I think we've lost, I think President Biden keeps talking about over the horizon capabilities, and an intel expert, a geospatial person said it's over the horizon. We're very far away. And intel is the key. It's absolutely the key. So that's very problematic. We've also weakened our relationship with our NATO partners, we basically abandoned them too. And President Biden, I think, I'm going to say it straight out, was dishonest when he talked about how he spoke with them and they concurred, and I think they must have been quite shocked because they immediately refuted that publicly, and that's problematic. So we did not just abandon our own people there and our own Afghan allies on the ground. We also abandoned our NATO allies that are there. And so I think that's also very dangerous when you're talking about global terrorism. And that is what this is. It is global. China and Russia are now, they've been added to the mix. And already the Taliban provisional government is talking about bargaining, wanting financial aid. And the Biden administration is talking about sending relief money, I guess, to the victims in Afghanistan who are being victimized by the people they're calling soft, friendly Taliban. It's also incredibly convoluted, and I think all of this is very dangerous, extremely dangerous. And I like what Pete brought up about the criminal versus legal paradigm, or war paradigm, criminal versus war paradigm. That's also a part of the confusion here, because there are people in this country who have been trying for 20 years to get us back to the legal paradigm. And I think one of the reasons why the KSM trial has been dragging on so long is because that has been countenanced at the DoD level. There's been too much latitude in the courtroom. I think the JAG process has been really neglected and abused, with it, whether it's the assignment of judges or the assignment of the attorneys, just the entire legal staff. So I think these issues are all really important. But to answer your question, yes, I believe we're in much more danger, because we're a divided country now too. That's hard, because you can't have a catastrophic thing like this happen in Afghanistan, which has shocked, I think, the world on both sides of the aisle, and be talking about an infrastructure bill when the country is yearning for leadership. So we have a leadership problem here, a big one.
Let me just build a little bit off of what Deborah is, because I'm not sure in some ways we're at September 10, because I think the threat is significant today, and maybe as significant as it was then, except we have put mechanisms in place that make it more difficult for people to attack us at the homeland. But in some ways, we're also at late morning of September 11, because I can only imagine what Deborah and her family were going through on the late morning of September 11, wondering where her brother was. For the people who had family members for one reason or another that were headed to the Twin Towers, whether they worked there or whether they were part of the New York Fire Department and they were heading there to save people. But their families were wondering, maybe well into the evening, maybe for days and weeks, what was happening. We have similar people like that right now here in the country, who are wondering and worrying and concerned about the safety of their loved ones in Afghanistan, some of whom are American citizens, some of whom are maybe Dutch citizens that that serve there as part of our allies, our Afghan partners, those that enabled us to do so much of the work that we did in Afghanistan. Some of their family members are in the United States. They're waiting for their other family members to come home or come and join them in the United States, as we promised we would do to them. Or they're maybe wondering whether they're even alive at this point, and hearing the stories of what may or may not be going on with the Taliban in Afghanistan. So in that way, we have lots of people around the world who probably with good justification believe that their family members, their acquaintances, their co-workers are in great danger in Afghanistan right now, and they're wondering whether they'll ever see them alive again.
So we have this debacle in Afghanistan now, Deborah, and the center's done lots talking about how bad it is, but we've also tried to come up with some ideas on how to fix it. What could we advise Congress to do on a bipartisan basis to try to salvage this catastrophe?
Well, my first thought, which isn't very helpful, is we need to impeach this president. But I know that that's probably not going to happen. I say that not as a partisan. I was a liberal Democrat for most of my life, I think till 2010. But I think I think the leadership is, if it's not going to happen now, I think we need to install people who are going to have a better grasp of what's going on and deal with it honestly with the American people. And also, when it comes to national security, that should be something where Republicans and Democrats can actually talk to each other and agree on things. Because after all, they represent Americans, and all of their constituents are targeted by terrorism. And so I think that is something that should happen, that there should be, I'm not sure if it's possible, but in the coming elections, I'm hoping that the American people will take this into consideration when they think about who will represent them in Congress. And unfortunately, sometimes it takes hugely catastrophic attacks to wake people up. And I have said 9/11 was a wake-up call for many people. And so I don't know the answer to that, but we need leadership that will confront this head on and squarely, and is willing to reach across the aisle and get involved in Pete, you can talk to this better than me. But it doesn't seem like national security should be something that should really be above politics.
Yeah, I mean,
Pete, I want to ask you that, but you and I have talked about this, and I think that it's urgent to have a bipartisan effort to get some men and women of stature and gravitas into government, men and women with a backbone. There's Democrats who would do this, who will say no to Joe Biden when he proposes something else that's frankly bonkers for our national security. And one of these people I propose, Pete, is your former Democratic House Intelligence Committee colleague, Jane Harman. I just wanted to throw that out and see what you think.
Yeah. Well, I think, Deborah's very correct in that this calls for leadership. Impeachment's not going to happen.
It's not.
But on a bipartisan basis, Congress, I think, believes that this is a debacle that we've maybe not experienced since 20 years ago. And as such, on a bipartisan basis, I think a viable option is to censure this president, a strong vote of disapproval of the strategies and the decisions that he has made, engaging with the Taliban, surrendering to the Taliban, leaving Afghanistan with Americans and others still there. Because poor judgment, from my perspective, doesn't necessarily rise to high crimes and misdemeanors or treason, the guidelines for impeachment. But I think Congress is well within its bounds to, censure the president for the direction that he put America in. At the cabinet level, these Blinken, Austin, Miley, they do not have, the validation of an election. They're Senate appointees approved by the Senate. I think it'd be appropriate. These are the people that implemented the president's strategy. They implemented it very, very poorly. And I believe that it's appropriate and the Senate can do this. I don't think they have to go to impeaching these individuals. They can send a strong enough signal that these individuals would recognize the need that they should resign. How does the Senate do that? By just voting a strong message of lack of confidence, lack of support in the leadership that these three individuals have provided. They either, implemented a strategy that they agreed with and did it very, very badly, or they implemented a strategy that they knew would not work, but moved forward and did it anyway. They should have resigned before they were actually, before they would even implement a strategy that they knew that wouldn't work. So those three are the primary architects of this disaster, and they should resign. And there are, leaders on both sides of the aisle. But if you want to keep it partisan and say, the president should have strong advisors, there are people like Jane Harman, and I'm sure Deborah knows Jane because we worked so closely together on the Intelligence Reform Act, who bring the gravitas and the willingness to speak, to speak truth to power, to address and to be there and to reinstill confidence with the American people. But if you take those steps, you send a strong message to the American people, you send a strong message to our allies, but you also send a strong message to our enemies that we know we screwed this up and we've made the changes to make sure we don't do it again, because America hasn't changed. We just made a series of bad decisions, but America is still who we've always been, and we've learned from this mistake, and we'll move on.
I want to make a brief comment, and then I'm going to ask Adam Savitt to allow people watching us to go to webinar to send us some questions. Jane Harman and Pete Hoekstra were on the House Intelligence Committee together, and at the time they worked together as partners. They cooperated most of the time. It's so sad what has happened to the House Intelligence Committee under Adam Schiff and other partisan Democrats who basically have destroyed intelligence oversight. I mean, not that Pete and Jane got along all the time, but they're still friends. They work together as friends on the committee, and it is really a tribute to both of them that Pete Hoekstra today can say he'd recommend Jane Harman to be in the cabinet under Joe Biden. I hope someone is listening to this recommendation.
And I think, one of the major accomplishments was, doing the intelligence reform bill, which it hasn't worked out exactly the way we all wanted it to, but that was Jane and myself, Susan Collins, a moderate Republican, and Joe Lieberman, an independent. And we got into the room every day, the same room for 4 or 5 hours, and hashed this out, knowing we needed to get something done to keep America safe. And our focus was not on Democrat, Republican, but it was, this is the problem. We've got the background. We became friends, and we recognized that we had to get this accomplished. And we all sacrificed some of our own ideals and that, and what we thought needed to be done just to make sure we got to a solution.
That's great. Thanks. Adam?
When and why did the magnificent coming together of all Americans after 9/11, waving our flag in unison, disappear into partisan political rhetoric, with Democrats claiming that loving our flag is a Republican concept?
It's, I'm not sure exactly when, 2000, Iraq led to that, or, going into Iraq, the lack of weapons of mass destruction, and then the 2006 election really, I think is where the turning point from my perspective was, and, to have the symbol of the United States being viewed as a Republican or a Democrat, serving in the Netherlands as the ambassador, it was heartwarming, because I know to the Dutch, when we came to Memorial Day, or we came to Liberation Day, or the commemoration of Operation Market Garden, a bridge too far, the Dutch treat America so well. They treat our servicemen and women who sacrificed during World War II, and they respect our flag, and they know what it stands for. And then to have that question in the United States is very, very heartbreaking.
Deborah, did you want to comment?
Well, I would just say that I think the whole idea about patriotism and the symbol of the flag, my parents' generation, called the greatest generation, who fought World War II, their not long after World War I, really, that my husband's grandfather was in the trenches in World War I. I just think our country has changed culturally, and there's been I remember someone saying to me, Deborah, you're now in the middle of the culture wars, and this was in I think 2005. And I said, no, I'm not part of that, or whatever that is. But I was. There is this culture war going on about what it means to be an American. And that, by the way, isn't something that was ever discussed when I was a kid. I mean, well, it was, but it was just sort of assumed that America stood for these very good things. And I remember asking my dad when I was a teenager about the Vietnam War, because there was a lot of, as you know, turmoil about that and protest in the streets. And he said, Deborah, and my father was very patriotic. He took us to every museum and Arlington Cemetery and monuments all over Washington, D.C. and all over the country, really. We were a military family, so he really loved America, and his brothers and sisters in that generation did too. But when I asked that question about Vietnam as a teenager, he said, America is a really young country. Compared to other countries in the world, we're like teenagers, and sometimes teenagers make mistakes, and then you learn and you go on. And I think the cultural turmoil now is coming from a different premise. That there is now a generation who has rejected the premise that my generation was brought up with, is America can make mistakes, but we're good at we have these core values. And I don't know how that gets fixed. And sometimes, that's why 9/11 was such a remarkable experience, where the country came together and really and truly came together. People were kind to each other. People didn't bring up these petty arguments about anything, really. It was just we were all we have, and we have to survive together. And I don't know that we can get back to that, but unfortunately it might take another very bad attack, and that's what I worry about. Will we cohere? Will we come together if that happens? I think we will, but I don't want to find out.
Speaking of not coming together, question, what do you think of some on the left comparing the January 6, 2021 events to 9/11?
Is that one for me?
Deborah's written on this, so yeah.
Well, I was shocked to see that comparison. I was mostly shocked to see that comparison from members of Congress, political leaders. But then I also saw they compared, that piece was heavily edited, Pete, because I had much more of a kitchen sink in there. They compared it to the Holocaust. I think another member of Congress compared the people there to the KKK. Civil War got put in there, Pearl Harbor. And I just think from my point of view, that was just intellectually unserious and just rhetoric, absolute rhetoric to make it, again, to politicize it beyond what it really was. And I don't think that, regardless of whether you think the election was stolen or not, I think the people on that lawn, according to Christopher Wray, the vast majority of them were there to peacefully protest what they believed was a stolen election, as opposed to trying to overturn an election. And yes, it just simply got politicized. And I think, look, 9/11 isn't a sacred cow that can't ever be insulted. The memory of it, I've gotten used to that. But I think people in positions of responsibility shouldn't give in to that kind of really destructive rhetoric. To compare that event, which happened in a matter of hours, Congress is back in session, to 9/11, which destroyed a subway system. The PATH train was taken out down there. 16 acres were either completely destroyed or made uninhabitable. 3,000 people died, and thousands more have died from the illness, from what they breathed down there. 3,000 children lost parents, actually more than that if you consider family members that were killed. And it completely changed the nation. It sent the nation to war. We have more now, double war casualties than the people we lost on 9/11. It's a horrific thing that happened to us. And so I think it was a very glib thing that was done purely for political reasons. And I think that's deeply, deeply disheartening, especially coming from some of our leaders on Capitol Hill.
Pete, why don't you take this one? Do you think the Patriot Act has been successful, or how should it be reformed? And this might have to be the last question.
Yeah, I think obviously the Intelligence Reform Bill, the Patriot Act, they've had an impact. We've not had an attack again in the homeland in these 20 years. So there's clearly been an impact. The enemy wants to attack us here again. They haven't been able to. So all of the things that we put in place have made America somewhat safer. We're still not safe. We're still vulnerable, and we're more vulnerable today than we were 3 weeks ago. In terms of the Patriot Act, what I'm most concerned about are the erosion of personal liberties, personal freedoms, and the license that it appears that some of our policymakers believe that the Patriot Act has given them to surveil Americans, to monitor Americans. And it just makes me extremely nervous. I was there when when it was developed. The intent was to provide our law enforcement and intelligence communities the latitude to keep America safe, and at the same time protecting American civil liberties. I'm not sure that we got the balance right.
Well, Pete Hoekstra and Deborah Burlingame, thank you so much for joining us for this thoughtful and difficult discussion. We can never again allow a terrorist attack like the al-Qaeda 9/11 terrorist attacks to occur again. And to make sure that it doesn't occur again, we have to educate future generations on exactly what happened on 9/11/2001. We can't let this be whitewashed. We can't shy away from who did it and why they did it. We can't pretend that the threat does not continue. And your comments today, I think, will go a long way to educating Americans on what really happened. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for
that. I'd like to thank our viewers for joining us, and my colleague Adam Savitt is now going to tell you a little bit about our upcoming webinars.
September 29th, we'll have a webinar entitled Emboldened Iranian State-Sponsored Terrorism in the Raisi Era, featuring our Victoria Coates, Congressman Claudia Tenney of New York, Marshall of Billingsley, and Simone Ledeen, moderated by Brian Lieb. On October 6th, I'm looking forward to hosting author Carrie Gershonek. We will be coming out. Center for Security Policy Press will be releasing a book entitled Media Warfare, Taiwan's Battle for the Cognitive Domain. That's on October 6th. We thank you for joining us today to mark the solemn occasion. Remember that the Center's timely and insightful programs like today's are only possible because of your generous support. If you do enjoy these webinars as much as I do, please visit our website, securefreedom.org. Click on the donate button in the upper right corner where you can make an instant contribution by credit card or get info about other methods of giving. Thanks again to our panelists. We'll see you on September 29th for our Iran panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.